Your submission said that you also implemented the first district level tabletop exercise for incident management. Can you speak about those? It said 3 exercises, kind of who was involved, where they were held, etc.
So tabletop exercises, I love because they're a great way to really enhance your plan and make sure you and your team know what your roles are going to be. And while the scenarios are obviously different, there's a lot of frameworks that you can establish in those exercises that are just really helpful when you're in the moment responding to a crisis that you know that are already laid out for you. And so we started with an exercise with our security team. So our emergency preparedness coordinator developed a scenario for us to utilize just among our team. And we not only wanted to do that to help enhance our team's abilities, but also to test various elements of at the time, our draft emergency operations plan. And once we completed it with our office, we then moved on to the operations division and did it with our chief operating officer and the various department heads within operations, which is where our department is housed, along with facilities management, nutrition services, student transportation, information technology, capital programs, and nursing, and talked through that same scenario just with our operations division and department heads to think through what all of our teams would be doing. And then moving into our superintendent's cabinet, which includes our superintendent and all of her direct reports at the time, all the division heads and school level leaders. Again, not only trying to build that capacity within those various teams, but also to test the various elements of the emergency operations plan. Because there are a lot of questions, there are a lot of different things that have to be thought through in an emergency, and the time you don't want to be thinking through those is in the middle of a crisis. And so you want to try to establish those systems ahead of time so that everybody knows their roles and responsibilities during a crisis. And in a controlled environment is the best place to do that. We're certainly thankful to get the opportunity to do that. And learn the lessons that we did, because there are always lessons that come out of it. So we were able to establish an improvement plan and put it into a matrix that kind of let us track those issues that we needed to address. And then at that period of time, we were able to make some tweaks to our emergency operations plan just prior to sending it to the printers. So it really helped in that regard.
Yeah, so we have a course that we did a couple of years ago called Adulting 101, and it was I want to say it was about a 1-week course, but we broke it down for our high schoolers, and they had an opportunity to go through different things. I mean, there's things unrelated to school safety, like their cooking, laundry, this kind of stuff. But one of the things we taught was self-defense. And then we also taught American Red Cross first aid, CPR, and AED usage. And that covers the gambit. That's not just adults, but that's adult, children, and pediatric care. So we cover everything, whether we've got the mom on campus with her infant child doing a tour of the school, or whether we have a grandparent here as an alumni. So we sent our kids through that, and we broke them down in about 30 per group. They went through it. I felt like, participation was great. They were into it. It kind of became a competition amongst some of them, how fast they could do chest compressions, which I had to kind of rein that in a little bit. But walked away with gaining that experience. Some of our students are babysitters. Some of ours are during the summer or lifeguards. So it was already beneficial for them. And so over the course of the summer, we had a rising junior and that rising junior's girlfriend. And unbeknownst to her, she had a heart condition at that time. And one evening, as they were returning home, she went into cardiac arrest while in a vehicle as he was taking her back to the house. And so training kicked in, those scenarios that we put him through, the stress and those kind of things. He was able to revert back to his most basic fundamental training, extracted her from the vehicle, got her on a firm, flat surface, started administering chest compressions, notified 911, and was able to revive her and bring her back. So I just think that was an incredible achievement on him and way to show poise under a stressful moment.
I also thought it was neat that you said that you included students from the theater department for the Stop the Bleed scenario training. How did that come about, and how did that work out?
So I am still attached to a local police department, and we do training out there with them. One of the courses that we train our officers in is Stop the Bleed. And it's typically taught to your hospital staff, to your first responders like law enforcement, and to EMS. I saw the need in it because it's one of those after action responses I think everybody should have. My conscience cannot deal with the fact that I could have a student, a parent, a loved one hemorrhaging uncontrollably, and us not do anything to care for that individual. Because some of your readers and listeners may know this already, but a lot don't. When a scene is considered a crime scene, whether it's a school or a business, EMS will stage. It's a national policy a mile, 2 miles down the road while law enforcement comes onto the campus or to the location. And law enforcement must deem that location clear before EMS is going to come in there. Well, we're a 55-acre campus. I can't sit there and wait 20 or 30 minutes while I've got a student bleeding and do nothing. So we saw that the need to bring that training to our faculty as well and give our teachers, the confidence and the empowerment. And we thought it was very important that we put them through stressful scenarios as well. So it took a lot of planning, but we reached out to our theater guild, to our drama students, and we wanted to make this as realistic as possible. We thought that it would be beneficial that it be students that be our role players. So our teachers are forced to go through that, seeing an injured student that they know that they may have helped watch grow up at this school and still be able to prioritize care. And so our injured students loved it. They got service hours for coming out and doing it for us.
Speaking of mentorship, there was one photo in your Director of the Year nomination submission that really stood out to me. And it was you standing in front of a group of students and you were showing them how to tie ties. And can you speak to that photo a little bit and its significance and importance to you?
Sure. That's part of my mentoring group, Men in the Making. Men in the Making started out as the right field, right as in if you're writing a letter, and feel like a baseball field. And so in St. Petersburg in 2011, we had 3 officers killed in the span of 30 days. And the last one was a very close friend of mine. And he was killed by a 17-year-old teen. So myself and Reverend Kenny Irby met, and we decided, what can we do to impact these children and make a difference so that we're not losing officers on one hand and kids aren't ruining their lives on the other. So we came up with this program, and the right field morphed into what we call Men in the Making. And our goal is to give kids experiences or take them on experiential type events, and then have them write about it. So we're looking at them from an exposure standpoint, but also academically to make sure that they get those skills. So one of the things that we do is that we teach them how to tie a necktie, because you'd be amazed at the number of adults who don't know how to tie a necktie. And so we don't want our kids to be hampered in any way. So if you're going to a job interview and you need to dress up, or if you're going on a first date and you want to impress your girlfriend, we want you to be able to tie a tie, because once you learn how to do it, you got it. And so we don't, just like you're learning your multiplication tables and learning the parts of a sentence and being able to write a paragraph, once they get those foundational knowledges of how to do that, they always have it. And so those are the types of things we try to do. We teach them, we take them to a restaurant called Grazzi's. It's an Italian restaurant. We teach them etiquette, where to place your napkin based upon what you're eating, which utensil to use when. We teach them the Heimlich maneuver. So it's just a number of activities that we do with them. We've taken them to the Veterans Cemetery and talked about veterans and contributions to the United States. And Fine Arts Museum, where after we left, the museum wanted to have some of our students as docents. So we've exposed upwards of 500 children since 2011. And we have people playing Division I football. We have musicians in the orchestra. We have every branch of the military that you can think of. And we have everyday people that are young men that have become adults through this program. So that's very, very important to me. And again, as you've mentioned, with the pandemic and with our children coming back, and our arrest numbers are going up. The activities with kids engaging with fights and other behaviors have gone up because they haven't been used to interacting with one another again. So it's very, very important that we get together and we work on correcting that problem.
over the last few years, you've written and secured almost $400,000 in grant funds. Can you talk about how you went about self-teaching yourself how to write grants? Doesn't sound easy.
Yeah, well, honestly, I mean, it was just really a lot of research, to be honest with you. I had never done it before. I thought you had to be some grant writer with, a special degree to write these grants. And quite frankly, after doing a lot of research, did talk to some grant writers, talk to other neighboring school districts and other police departments in the area. And, I just decided to go for it. One of the biggest things for grants, in my experience, is it's data driven. So, you want to make sure that, you have the systems to capture the data that you want to include into that grant. So one of the things that we had done when I came in is we updated our police report management system. So we were able to better capture, those incidents and that data. So we can provide that data on those grant applications, whether it's a local grant, or if it's a state or federal level grant, they have all that information. Same thing with our student databases. We needed to make sure that those databases were collecting all the information that we needed, again, to add into those grants. So yeah, I mean, honestly, it was really just a lot of research, and just taking a shot, honestly, just applying for that grant, putting it out there and seeing what happens. And thankfully, the first one we did is, it worked well. And actually that's what paid for the Silox system that I talked about a little while ago. So yeah, we were successful. One of the biggest things that if I was to say helped me the most in my research would be to stick with one item. I think when you start adding more than one particular item into a grant, you kind of dilute the grant. I think it just makes it a little bit more difficult for those that are trying to approve you to determine, what's priority for the district. Is it communications? Is it emergency management? So I did find in my experience that that's, I was denied, a couple grants because of that. So, again, with the experience, hey, stick with one item. If it's communications, then stick with communications. If it's emergency management, stick with emergency management. But yeah, just try not to dilute it too much to where it's going to be difficult for those approving your application to actually, decide which one is best for you.
It really worked out well for us. That tip line gave the students the option to email, website. They can make a phone call if they decided to, or they could send a text message. And so what we saw right away is they don't mind sending a text message. They're very good at it. I've got 3 children at home and they love to send text messages, right? So, the interesting thing is, how do you deal with that? Well, that's what we had to kind of work around. So we started with, we're about 26,000 students. So when we implemented this program, there were 4 of us, which received the text or the tips via email. And so when one of us received the tip, we would just respond to the tip, whoever was looking at the email at the time. And then we just kept our cell phones live with a group text, said, hey, I handle tip number, whatever, 210, just to kind of give us an update. But then as we grew as a department and I added another member to my department, we pretty much manage that now with 2 of us. He kind of goes to bed early and I go to bed late. So we do take those tips after hours. I mean, the last report I pulled from last school year, which it was COVID year, so it was kind of odd. We had 43% of those tips coming in after hours. So what that means is there's, those students go home. I mean, you probably all know this, but they go home and they start texting and they start Snapchatting, they start Instagramming, and some of those students decide to send inappropriate materials or statements, and so reports come out of those. And so another student may see that, they'll take a quick picture of that Snapchat and they'll forward it to the tip line, which is fantastic because it gives us the opportunity to investigate it before. If somebody says they're going to shoot the school up, well, I want to know about that at 9 o'clock the night before and not wait till 6:30 next morning to find out about it when I already have kids coming to campus. So that's really what centered me around the thought process of, hey, we've got to start acting now. I can't exactly remember the year, and I know I've been with them for several years now, but when we started, I mean, there was one situation where a student had made a threat about shooting up the school. And it was like 2 o'clock in the morning when the tip came in, and how one of us picked it up, I don't know. I don't recall how that transpired. One of us got it, and we started making phone calls to our local officers, and we got with the command staff, the night shift command, and they got an officer to that door that day and addressed, or that night, and addressed the issue. I hate to say it, but I think even this school year, when we started our school year at 5 o'clock in the morning, our first day, we had the FBI was actually at a door of a student off of a tip received. I mean, it's just, you can't wait on those things anymore. You know, there used to be a day where a school would say, hey, we'll deal with this the next morning. We're past that in my book, in my opinion, and how we treat it here at Lexington One is we're going to act now to try and prevent any harm from occurring.
And for campuses or districts, they're obviously always updating or changing their camera system. So for a campus or a district that might be considering a similar video surveillance project to what you're doing now, what are some pieces of advice you would offer to them?
Well, I think the first thing would be your integrator, the company you're going to hire to do this for you. Find one that you can work well with and that you built that you believe you can build a relationship with, because I think that's imperative. Because I use a lot of systems in my job, and if you have an integrator that you just have I don't want to say a bad relationship with, but a tough time working with, it's gonna slow down progress, and it's not the best. So yeah, so that's number one. Find somebody that you can really work with. Preferably local, because if I'm working with a company and they're on the East Coast, I got to wait for, just like you and I got to wait for the time to be right. And then there's the communication. They got to call somebody else. Whereas local, they can drive to me in 10 minutes, 20 minutes, so that's very important. And as far as the equipment, it's know what functions you're looking for, know what it is you're looking for when you go into it. And quite honestly, I didn't know everything, but I did my research. I believe I did my due diligence. I knew, so going into the RFP, I kind of had an idea of what technology was out there. And I didn't put it all down because I wanted people to tell me what they were going to offer and what they could give. The next thing is, I guess, know how much you want covered, in reference to the cameras. I mean, I'm not putting a camera every 10 feet. I know what it is I want covered. And in my example, I wanted 100% coverage on the exterior of our buildings, both for during the day and our perimeter protection at night, security for our schools at night. And then on the inside, they're not every single area is not covered, but you can't get to any area in my school, those schools that already have the cameras completed, you can't get to any area without passing through one that's already covered by a camera. So although I don't have cameras in every single location, you can't get there without passing through one of the cameras. And then I'll go back, that ease of use is so important. You have to have something that's user friendly.